Okay, so here we are. This is the video for the example of the tax when it's levied on the buyer. So this is kind of example 2. So this is similar to the one we did in class. It's the market for coffee. But now this 70-cent tax is going to be imposed on the buyers of coffee. So remember now, if the tax is on the buyers, that means technically the buyers are the ones that have to pay the government. Therefore, we're going to shift the demand curve, okay? Okay, so now let's go through all these steps and fill in our graph, okay? So part A says draw the market for coffee in equilibrium. Be sure to label everything appropriately, okay? So what that means is that, all right, let's draw our supply and demand diagram, all right? So we're going to go down here, label our axes, quantity, price, draw in our demand curve, something like this. Okay, and label it with a D. This is our market for coffee. Okay, and then I'm going to put in a supply curve. Let's do something like this. Label with supply. Let's go back here and let's grab black and label the equilibrium. There we go. P star and Q star. Okay. Now I think in the example I did in class, I think the equilibrium quantity was 750, but that's not important, right? On an exam, that's what you need to do, right? P star, Q star, everything is labeled, okay? So now, we've done part A, right? We've drawn the market for coffee in equilibrium before the tax is implemented. So draw what happens in the market when the tax is implemented. Be sure to label the price that the buyer pays and the price that the seller gets after the tax. All right, so now this is where we're going to shift the demand curve because there's a tax, but we have to shift it down by the size of the tax. And that's where this legend over here on the right comes into play, okay? So I'm going to use the green color. Now I have to do it this way because I'm using an iPad, but basically I have to create a little line. It's basically the exact same size of that tax, okay? And then I'm going to create a tool here, and I'm going to grab it, and I'm going to move it over here. So what I'm doing is I'm going to shift my demand curve down by the size of the tax. Again, I'm shifting it down a vertical distance, okay? So there's one there. I'm then going to copy it. Come on. Okay, let's go up here. Fine, we'll paste there. Paste. There we go. So now I've got two of these little lines. Now you're probably wondering why I have two of these little lines floating around here, okay? The reason is that I'm going to go up here to my color, and I'm going to grab blue, right? And I'm going to put a dot here and a dot here. So now what I've done is I have put in two dots that are vertical distance down the size of the tax from my demand curve, okay? So I can now do the following. I can now draw in my new demand curve, and I'm going to draw it right through those two dots. Okay, that's not exactly right through those two dots. Let's try this again. I'm going to draw it right through those two dots. There we go. And I'm going to label this D and put a T there for the tax, okay? So now I'm going to go ahead and delete those green lines, right? So now what I've done is I've created a demand curve that is shifted downward the size of the tax, okay? And now I can go in and fill in what the rest of the problem wants. So I'm going to go back here to black, right? So the second part here is I got to label the price that the buyer pays and the price that the seller gets, right? Well, this is our new equilibrium price at the intersection of our new demand curve and our supply curve. So I'm going to go over here and label it here, right? Now, this is the price that the seller gets, right? Because this distance up to here is the size of the tax that the buyer now has to pay. And I would draw over here. And this is the full price the buyer pays, right? So because the buyer pays the tax to the government, right, the seller doesn't have anything to do with the tax. So the buyer pays that price to the seller, and then the buyer has to, in addition, pay that sales tax to the government, right? And this is something we're familiar with. When we get our receipt from the store, it shows how much we paid the seller, and then it shows that extra tax that was added on that we had to pay as the buyer, right? Okay, so now we can go ahead and finish labeling this, right? This is the quantity after the tax, all right? And so let's go up here. We've now done part B, okay? So now, let's look at part C. Label the area that represents consumer surplus after the tax, okay? Well, the area that is consumer surplus after the tax, I'm going to switch to the highlighter mode, and let's go with pink, okay? Well, that's going to be the area above the price the buyer pays and below the demand curve, right? So that's this area here. There we go. Okay. This is consumer surplus. All right, so we did that. What about producer surplus after the tax? Well, let's go switch color. Let's go, I don't know, let's go with yellow. Producer surplus after the tax. Again, producer surplus is that area that's below the price that the seller gets and above the supply curve, okay? So let's go ahead and label this. This is producer surplus. This is consumer surplus, okay? All right. So we've done part D, label the area that represents producer surplus after the tax. Now let's label the area that represents the tax revenue. Well, remember, that's that rectangle in the middle. So let's use my highlighter and let's go with, I'm running out of decent colors. Let's go with a nice pastel green. Okay, so this area right in here is tax revenue. Tax revenue, right? And this is what goes to the government. Okay, that whole rectangle there. All right, so we've done part E. Lastly, part F, label the area that is deadweight loss. Okay, well, remember that's that little triangle here at the end, so let's go with, let's go with, I don't know, let's go with the blue. Maybe blue will work here. Oops. Can I? Oh, yeah, let's do a smaller tip. There we go. Okay, that'll work. This triangle right here is our deadweight loss triangle. So let's go back to this size tip and go back to a normal highlighter. And then this triangle right there is deadweight loss, and we abbreviate that with DWL, okay? All right, so now I'm done. So now I've filled in this graph. Now notice, right, at the end, after it's all said and done, it looks just like the example we did in class when the tax was on the seller, right? And that's because, again, buyer and seller share in the tax. So either the tax is on the seller, and that shifts the supply curve up, or the tax is on the buyer, and that shifts the demand curve down. But after that, it all ends up coming out about the same, okay? All right, and that is all she wrote for that example.